Welcome to the Stray Pointers podcast, where seemingly ordinary people join us for extraordinary discussions. You're listening to Season 2, Episode 10 of the Stray Pointers podcast. This episode was recorded on April 18th, 2024. I'm your host, Jim Lawless. For more information about the show, including the show notes for this episode, please visit straypointers.com. Joining the show tonight is longtime computing and electronics innovator and celebrity, Jim Brain. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Hey, Jim. So you and I first crossed paths when I got a Commodore 128 for the second time back in the mid-90s, and I went out online in search of a community, and I found a thriving one there. And I think you had recently taken over the chores of the free text file magazine, Commodore Hacking, and you
Correct.
were what appeared to be the busiest man alive on the comp.sys.cbm news group, publishing FAQs and lists and trivia and all sorts of things. In addition to, you were writing for some of the second generation of Commodore 8-bit magazines at the time. So I know a little bit about your story. You and I have met before, talked before. Why don't you tell me a little bit about the formative years in for you with electronics and computing? What was your introduction to that sort of tech?
Well, I think like everybody, when I was growing up, the Atari 2600 was, a big deal. And so I wanted a video game machine. And my father basically sat down and said, listen, I'm not going to just buy you a game machine. If you want something that's going to play games, then you need to buy a computer. And so one of the cheapest ones that were available in the old Wards and Sears catalogs was the Commodore VIC-20. So I think it was $233. That was like 81 or 82, somewhere in that time frame. That and didn't, managed to be able to secure that with my money, shore money, and mowing the lawn money or whatever. Didn't have a storage unit. Drives were very expensive. Cassette units weren't that expensive, but I ran out of money after I bought a couple games. And quite honestly, I played it for a little bit and then grew tired of it and put it on a shelf for about a year. And then managed to get into, I don't know what it's called now, but in my high school, or my school system, was called junior high. So that would have been 7th grade.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a computer lab, and that had been outfitted with Commodore 64s. So evidently the apples were too expensive, and so they purchased Commodore 64s. So that was a room. I enjoyed that class and whatnot. I thought, hey, I've got one of these Commodore machines sitting in on a shelf somewhere. So I pulled it out. I started playing with it, and that was probably where I started getting interested in programming it. There were other people in the class that were interested in making, we'd make little games out of BASIC, or a lot of times we'd try to write software to try to solve the math problems that we had, so we didn't have to, because we were lazy. We didn't want to actually do the homework, so we'd write programs on the Commodore to do that. By that time, I think that was like 83, 84, probably 84.
Now,
and
let me stop you for just a second. So we can go back to that first purchase. Your dad really influenced that purchase. That's pretty prescient for a parent in the early 80s to, to have that kind of vision. Was your dad an engineer of sorts?
I mean, he was involved in auto mechanics, so he had kind of a technical background. He hadn't went to school for engineering, but auto repair is definitely a mechanical capability.
Sure.
He enjoyed electronics as well, so that was kind of a thing he did. He didn't have a background in electronics, but he could fix some of the smaller devices that we had at the house. If there was something wrong, like a resistor was blown or a transistor, he'd go down to the local radio supply place in the town we were near, and he'd buy a replacement. So he kind of understood the kind of, I would say, high level electronics background. I really do think he was just, I don't want to play. I don't want you to get a game. He must have read something where it was going to be this whole computing for the masses or computing for everybody at some point in the future. It must have been a newspaper article or something. But yeah, I would say my career in IT through all the years can be traced to, wanting a game machine and him saying, no, you can buy something that can play games, but it needs to do more than that.
Did he ever take up using a computer?
Yeah, I mean, for work, he ended up with the IBM PC. They had a lot of, you could get Chilton manuals and whatnot on there and do purchases and whatnot. My mom bought a +4 and then later on a C128 to do the books. So we had the Commodore accounts payable, accounts receivable kind of applications. She had those, and she did the books on the unit for a number of years. In fact, I don't even know how many years she used the machine for that. And he would dabble around on it. He didn't really play games. That wasn't really his thing. But sometimes I would show him, productivity software or something. Of course, he was happy that my mom had done the books on the computer, because then he could go in and look at what kind of what the, because we owned our own company, so what the business was making, or where we needed to bring in more money or have more repairs or whatever. So I think it was value. He was a recipient of some of the value of the computer. I don't think he did a lot, except he was just, he was probably just a standard user of the computer, not really doing anything related to programming or anything.
Okay. So before I interrupted you, we were about up to 1984. You were you were playing with Commodore 64s
in school.
In school.
Yeah. And I mean, that was when the bottom dropped out of, I think that was when Jack Tramiel wanted to kill off the rest of the machines. So the 664 ended up like under $150. I got that. I got a 1541. I had a TV for the longest time, so evidently the monitor must have been something. I decided that was just too much extraneous cost. But I used that C64 all the way up until my senior year of college. So that would have been, I bought it in 7th grade, used it all through high school, wrote all the papers, did all the whatevers, used it, and I went to the University of Illinois, used it to do a lot of my term papers. There was a system at the University of Illinois at the time called Plato, which was an early, kind of networked system, and the University of Illinois had a lot of their courses on Plato. And at the time, there was a somewhere out there is still a client for the C64, and so all your physics homework and everything you needed to do, you could go to the lab and do it, or you could use a PC, or in this case, my case, a Commodore 64, to get onto the Plato system and then go do your homework while you were sitting in your dorm room, which was a huge benefit.
Wow. Have you ever met Tom Cherry Holmes, or do you know Tom Cherry Holmes?
Yep.
Yeah, I think he's revived Plato.
Mm-hmm.
I think he has a version working with FujiNet with his creation.
Yes, he does. And he has I think somebody's made a new 64 client. I always keep looking through my old discs. Somewhere around here, I think I have the original, like written by the University of Illinois or wherever Plato originated from, version of Plato that was back in the day was the official software if you wanted to use the C64 for Plato instead of like a recreation. But yeah, it was an interesting system. Now that we're years beyond it, I look back, we didn't really appreciate it for what it was while it was in use. So that's unfortunate, but I did get to use the system while I was in college up until, and like I said, use the Commodore up until my senior year. I got a scholarship my senior year I was in computer engineering and got a scholarship, decided I probably needed to get a PC. So I got a laptop for my senior year of studies and tried to learn the whole PC thing before I got into the real world.
Now, your field of study was computer engineering?
Yep, that's right.
So is that where you first took up electronics?
No, I've done, like I said, my my dad was interested in electronics. So when I was growing up, the family, so we were in this town of about 30,000 folks, and there was a mall, but you remember those things, right?
Hmm.
There was a mall, an indoor mall, in the town, and then right on the other side of the major street through the town was a Radio Shack. And
Okay.
so I remember many Sundays or whatever day it was, the family would go out for lunch, and then everybody wanted to go to the mall, and I didn't want to go to the mall. The mall was just kind of boring, so I would tell them I'd like to be dropped off at Radio Shack. And so I would get dropped off at Radio Shack, and they'd be gone for like 2 hours. And so I'd go through, and it's hard to tell people now, but back in the day, Radio Shack had all their discrete components on little bubble packs or whatever, and they'd have them all on this huge wall.
Yep.
And so I would have, $30 or something. And so I'd go through and I'd get some resistors, and I'd get a transistor, and I'd get a LED, and I'd get I don't know, a potentiometer or a switch or whatever. And you'd have a little, like, I don't think they had baskets. So you just held it in your hands and you'd count it all up, and you decide, well, that's $30. And then you'd start putting stuff back. And so over a course of a couple hours, I'd have dreamed up and discarded 3 or 4 different projects that required parts from Radio Shack. And then, I'd get, of course, they didn't have cell phones. So, excuse me, my parents had come in the door to the Radio Shack, and that was my cue to, hurry up and check out. And then I'd go home, and then through the week or whatever, you'd try to, build something based on the parts that you had. So I amassed a whole bunch of those Radio Shack bubble packs. I find them every once in a while, the ones from the 80s, diodes and resistors, and super expensive.
So instead of finding a project in a magazine and going looking for the parts, you started with the parts and then tried to figure out what you could build from that?
I did, because sometimes there would be like Radio Shack could have a special, like they were trying to get rid of something.
Hmm.
And then sometimes they would have, like, I mean, projects from magazines. I remember I had a subscription to Radio Electronics. I think there was another electronics magazine, Electronics Now or something. I had a subscription to. But if you remember, sometimes you go into Radio Shack and they'd have like stuff for other computers was there as parts. So I remember there were Atom keyboards there at one point. There were TI 994A keyboards, C16 keyboards. There was, for a while, they sold the speech chip that was in
Yeah.
the TI synthesizer, and they would sell those for not a ton of money. And so if you went in and they had one of those things going on, then you'd get a keyboard for a TI, because everybody needs an extra keyboard. And and I know I have one of those speech synthesizer chips in the bubble pack sitting here in one of my boxes. I was like, oh, everybody needs a speech synthesizer. And of course, I never actually built the thing, but that was the deal. You'd start with the stuff, and then of course you had to think of all the projects in your head. Like, okay, let's see, if I'm gonna make some sort of buzzer, then I'm gonna need a 555, and I got a speaker at home, but I need a couple resistors and a couple capacitors. And of course, you didn't have your phone, so you couldn't just look up a schematic to figure out what you need. You had to kind of remember it from something you'd read or something you'd like. I had one of those Radio Shack 150 and 1 electronic kits, and so you
Hmm.
try to remember, it was page 75, and you needed this resistor, this capacitor, and a 555 and something else, and you could build yourself a warbler, a bird warbler, or a siren. Or, I mean, I did stuff with it, and it was really interesting. I'm not sure that I got, for quite a while, I'm not sure that I was able to make much. But every time you would um, make a project, or every time you had more money, you'd add a little bit to your box of stuff. And I always used a breadboard. I bought a little, of course, Radio Shack breadboard. And so you'd make a project, and then you'd play with it for a while, and you'd tear it apart. Pretty soon you had a pretty big stash of components. And so then when you went to Radio Shack, you were just kind of adding to your stash that you would use to make these little projects. and and that happened. I mean, that was probably around the same time that I started using computers. And then eventually I got to the point where I was like, oh yeah, you know what? I'm gonna do computers, and I'm gonna do electronics. So I was probably probably there was a ton of geeks that did this, but I had a home security system for my room. I had a keyboard that I got from a calculator, and I wired it up to the joystick port on my Commodore, and I had, I don't know, a bunch of stuff that I could use, switches and wires, and I had the computer set up to run a program that if anybody typed in the wrong key code on the calculator keyboard and or open the door or whatever, it would make horrible noises. Got in trouble a couple times for that because I forgot to disarm the system, and I went to school and my parents came in, and it was this ear splitting sound because I'd have black and white TV, and I um, turned the sound all the way up, and I turned the contrast all the way down. So you couldn't tell the TV was on, but the sound was really high. And then somebody'd walk in the room and it'd give you like 5 seconds or something, and it'd start making these horrible sounds from the SID chip or whatever. So I did that for a while, and I remember running some sort of either wireless or wired connection to the basement where I had my little electronics lab. I was on the second floor, and so I could tell when somebody'd come in the house, and it was, I mean, yeah, there's a reason why we weren't necessarily the most uh, popular kids in school, right? But
Have just a quick detour. Have you ever read from Byte magazine Steve Ciarcia's issue
yes,
with when he locked himself out of his own house and
yes.
he had to defeat his own security system because he had brownies in the oven, and if he
Hmm.
didn't get in there soon, the smoke was going to trigger he probably ahead of its time. His alarm was connected to call the fire department,
Fire
through the
departments.
smoke. So he had to that whole story was him racing against time, trying to
Hmm.
defeat his own anti-burglar
Creation.
systems. Yep,
That's right.
yep. Okay, well, so at some point then, so the my personal interest in Commodore started about 1983, 1984, and went through up into maybe about 1987. I had an Amiga, but then
Hmm.
I sort of moved on to a PC. But it seemed like the Commodore 8-bit line, people were leaving that behind for some of the other computers. So you'd see magazines like Compute and Ahoy and Run and things like that were kind of going by the wayside. Um, then, like I said, when I got back into the hobby in the mid 90s, there was a magazine called Commodore World.
Hmm.
And I believe that the group behind that was, correct me if I'm wrong here, but was Creative Micro Devices behind that publication, or were they just CMD? Were they actually the publishers, or were they just like a big advertiser in that magazine?
No, they were the publishers. I think the company, you have to check, but I think the company is Creative Micro Designs.
I'm sorry.
But
Yeah.
yes, but it was CMD, and I mean, I had opportunity to talk quite a bit with Doug Cotton, who was the editor of that magazine.
Okay.
Can't remember how many episodes or how many issues they produced, but um, I remember talking to him about, why Commodore World, why do that. They were still selling quite a bit of components, hardware components. They had a hard drive and a floppy drive and a RAM link
Mhm.
and whatnot, at least at the time. And they were running short on like a user base to advertise. And so they finally decided that it might make sense for them to, put a magazine together. It would give them an opportunity to advertise to a group, and have these people kind of subsidize some of the cost of putting the magazine together. And so they did. They started that up. It started up before I was involved. I was a subscriber to it. I remember it being an ad in some other magazine that they were going to start up Commodore World, and I was like, "Ooh, another, a Commodore focused magazine," right? Because at the time, a lot of the Commodore magazines were either being subsumed into their Amiga counterpart, or they were just a part of, like, they used to be Compute's Gazette, and then it just kind of, yeah, I think it ended up being Byte, or not Byte, but Compute, and then it became Omni. I think it was the transition for that. So a lot of the Commodore only content was sort of he was drifting away into those other multi-platform magazines. But yeah, Commodore World started up, and they were the editorial staff, the production staff, and they hired all the authors, of which I ended up being an author for the magazine for quite a while. I think until the end of the the run that they had. They had a couple years, if I remember correctly.
So I referred to you in the intro as a celebrity. Was this the beginning of Jim Brain, the Commodore celebrity? Was it in the pages of Commodore World where you got
I
your best
I
exposure, your first exposure?
I think it was partially that, and it was partially the internet, like you mentioned. CompSys CBM. When I actually before I got out of college, I was in university. University of Illinois was and again trying to place things back a number of years, but before there was the internet, there was NSFNet, and when NSFNet was mainly designed to connect all the supercomputing centers of the United States. And one of the supercomputing facility, one of the National Center for Supercomputing Applications facilities was at the University of Illinois. So University of Illinois was connected to NSFNet, and NSFNet was one of the fastest. I think there was other parts of the internet, but NSFNet was the backbone. And so we had lots of bandwidth, and we had access to all these news groups. We found them pretty early when we got to school. And I saw CompSys CBM, and I'm like, oh, this is really cool. So there was that. Then I started asking questions. You can go back to, Google's archive, and you can see some stuff from JLB 31348, which was my uh, address when I was at the University of Illinois. And, just cringy type stuff, me asking questions about the platform. And of course, at the time, there were a lot of the Commodore um, people that were, worked at the company would be on that news group every once in a while, would answer questions and whatnot. And then once we left school, NSFNet turned into, that it became because there used to be an acceptable use policy on NSFNet, no commercial usage of the tool. And then right after I left in '93, they got rid of that restriction, and then that's when the internet started taking off. All of us that had grown up with the internet, we didn't want to lose it, and so we all continued to, or a lot of us continued to have access to it either through Genie or Delphi or a login system, an internet provider or whatnot. And I remembered staying on CompSys CBM, and then of course, as you mentioned, the big thing back in the day was that every month you would post somebody would post a frequently asked questions list or a FAQ to one of the news groups. Every news group had one, and the guy that did it before me was looking to step away, and I was like, oh, I think I could do this. I can organize information and whatnot. So I started working on that. That brought a lot of, I think, celebrity, and then of course the magazine articles were another thing. So I think it was like a 1-2 approach or 1-2 punch. There was people could see me when I was online, and then they'd read the articles and reviews that I did while I was at Commodore World. And so then it just, and of course people would, it's inevitable that if you have a question about the platform and somebody says, well, there's probably a Usenet news group for that. Go find one. You go find one. The first thing you're going to find is the FAQ. And then if you don't see your question answered in the FAQ, the first person you're going to ask is the guy that posted the FAQ. Well, I posted the FAQ. So I had a ton of people sending me questions. And of course I was young, and I didn't have a lot of anything else going on. I had kids or anything like that. So I had lots of free time in the evening, so I could answer questions. And it makes you feel, it's kind of like, hey, I'm kind of important because I'm answering people's questions from who knows where all over the world.
I know you had written some software. Did you write TCP SER, TCP SER? Was that yours?
I did. I
Okay,
did.
because I've run that recently. That was like the gateway for an emulator to the emulator thinks it's the emulated Commodore thinks it's talking to a modem, but really it's connecting to something else via TCP/IP over the internet and that sort of thing. You sort of gave your software away, but you started making hardware for the Commodore line.
Right.
And I know you had a slightly different name for your side gig at the time, but it later became Retro Innovations. What was the genesis of that company?
So that was about 2004. Um, so my wife was pregnant with our youngest child, a daughter, and she was not feeling the best. She had some pregnancy illness associated with it, and so she was in bed, and she was kind of taking care of herself. Our son was actually doing a big round with the grandparents, or I was taking care of him. But after I'd put him to bed at night, I had some extra time, and I just got to thinking, um, kind of what's going on. It had been 10 years since I'd left school, and I had gotten a degree in computer engineering. I used to do hardware projects when I was in university, but I hadn't really done anything about with that after I'd left. Software paid better when I left school.
Okay.
In the early 90s, it was a little, jobs were that was kind of a drought for jobs at the time, and so software paid better. So I took a software job, and I'd progressed my career writing software, but I hadn't done much hardware, and so I thought, well, you know what, my wife's, we can't really do a whole lot. She's not feeling the best. I'll take care of the kid, and when I'm not taking care of the kid, what else? What can I do? And I'm thinking I need to do something with these skills, or else I'm going to lose them. It'd been 10 years, and I'm thinking they're just gonna go away.
Mhm.
And so I got to thinking about it. I thought, well, microcontrollers was a big deal when I was in college, but when I was in college, the big microcontroller you would use was the 68HC11, which was kind of a lot of schools would use that. It was expensive. By that time, it was, 10 years older, and there was better stuff. PIC was a thing, but I looked at the PIC. It was hard for me to get my hands around it, or my head around it, and so I saw this other thing called an Atmel AVR. It was really nice. I could program in C because I already knew how to write C from writing much software, and it had a super simple uh, GCC was open source. You could download it on your computer and write the code. You didn't have to pay a lot of money. So very low entry cost. I think that was another thing. The PIC had a higher entry cost. You had to buy the studio to do the work, or the programmer, and so there's more involved. And I didn't want to spend a lot of money on it because I was afraid that I'd already lost my knowledge, and so I didn't want to put a lot of investment and waste the money. So I built a little programmer. I got the software. I started writing code, and I'm like, okay, now what am I going to do? Because I don't want to just write software. I want to do something electronic. And right beside me, on my desk, was my Commodore 64. I'd set it up to play games and whatnot. And I thought, I don't want to do anything interfacing with my PC, because if I toast my PC, then that's an expensive thing to replace. But at the time, like you said, that was early 2000s. You could go to a garage sale and pick up a Commodore for probably $5. People would give them away sometimes. So I thought, well, there's no real harm if I ruin this Commodore. And I thought, well, one of the things I'd always wanted to know how to do, or wanted to know how it worked, was the FAT file system. I always thought that was so cool. And I thought, well, I wonder if there's a way to interface the computer to a hard drive. I had an extra hard drives around. And so I thought maybe I could use an Atmel to do that work. And I'd learn how the FAT file system worked in the interim. And so I started working on this project, and I got it operating, a little bit. And as you do back in the day, you'd take a picture and you'd put it on, I don't know, whatever that wasn't, it was there. I don't think Imager was a thing, but somewhere you'd post a picture, or somewhere you'd put this thing, and you'd write a little blurb, and you'd say, hey, look at this cool little project that I made. And I just wanted to kind of celebrate that I managed to do something. I hadn't forgotten all my knowledge, and it was kind of cool. And I was able to load a directory on my Commodore, and I was able to save some files or whatnot. Immediately, people responded, and it was like that Futurama thing, like, shut up and take my money, right?
Yep.
And so I'm like, it's not even a thing. I mean, it's no, there's nothing to buy. I just did this. And so everybody's like, well, if you get them, if you decide to sell them, I'll buy one. So I thought, well, okay, I mean, I am kind of interested in it. So I learned, of course now it's super easy, but at the time, where do you go to make a circuit board, and is there somebody that can build the stuff? I built them by hand initially, and of course wrote some of the code, and then midway through writing the code, I found out that there was another open source project out on the internet that used the same controller and was doing similar stuff. And so I'm like, well, maybe that was farther along. So I was like, maybe I ought to retrofit um, my hardware to use that software, firmware or whatnot. So I ended up getting it done, and then I realized there were still all these shows that you could go to, these computer shows. And so I put a few of them together and I went to one of the shows. I had probably 10 of them or something, and they just sold like that. They were just gone. And people were just, I told somebody back in the day, I don't know that I do this now, but I would go to lunch and I'd come back and underneath my Commodore 64 would be like $75 or whatever, just tucked underneath there, and a little note that says, I took a micro IEC, thanks, Bob or whatever. And so people would just put money in there. Some people would just put money there and they just put their name and they said, hey, I want one, look me up when you get back from lunch or whatever. It was bizarre. People were just literally throwing money on the table and saying, I want one of these. So then after a while, it just, you get enough people and you're like, well, I guess I need to turn this into an actual thing. So you put up a storefront and you get a business account and you whatever, you do all the things that are necessary to actually have a business.
Now this didn't take over as your primary source of income, though.
No, I mean, I'll be honest, my wife jokes. There's been a number of times where through my career where I've thought, I could do this full time. I mean, not necessarily just for the Commodore platform, but if you did a bunch of stuff for a bunch of different platforms, there's some money to be had. But my regular my IT career, it's hard to step away from that. We've a couple times we've been okay. We're leaving this company. We'll get our debt's in pretty good shape, so we can just start up a business, and I've got some money saved away. But inevitably, somebody will call from the network, from your network of people, and they say, "Hey, there's this really, I need somebody to do this, and it's got your name all over it," and you're like, "Okay, well, I'll talk to you about it," and then it ends up being a great opportunity. So I still do this part time, but maybe one of these days there'll be a full time thing. But right now, it's nice because you can enjoy it as a hobby. So there's really I'm not worried about the costs or anything like that. But there is money coming in, and what I use it for primarily is any of the funds that come in from the side business. I either use it to buy parts for more projects or I buy equipment. Like back in the day, it was a big deal to have an oscilloscope. I mean, it was like, that's a lot of money. So now, if you go, I can buy like I bought a nice logic analyzer, older one, but still, a nice, $500 or $800 logic analyzer and a couple $100 oscilloscope or whatever. So if there's, it's nice to have equipment because it makes building projects a lot easier when you're just not shooting in the dark. Those first projects, when you don't have equipment, you're just like, well, it's basically the software equivalent of peppering your code with print statements to see if you can figure out what's going on. You'll get there, but it'll take so long.
Now, does the family get involved in the side gig?
Well, they did. So the kids are older now; they're off doing their own thing. But we put them to work when they were younger, so they filled orders. That was my fulfillment team. We used to joke. My daughter was putting a resume together, and she was the head of head of shipping at an electronics manufacturer or whatever, however you kind of reword those things. But yeah, they did that, and that was how they, we pay them good money, and they do fill orders on a regular basis, and that worked out really well, at least for the time that they were here. So that was that. Obviously, my wife takes care of the taxes and whatnot, but generally speaking, none of them. Well, growing up, none of them. This wasn't really their thing. They would help Dad with his side thing,
Okay.
But my son has, he's now doing software development and AI and whatnot. So he's kind of in a similar vein, not really electronics, but definitely computers.
Okay. What were some of your more popular items other than the micro IEC?
Zoom floppy has been a very popular item. So being able to archive Commodore disks onto the PC or Mac machine and I didn't design that. Actually, Nate Lawson designed the unit, but he was like, I'm going to design it, but I'm not going to, I don't want to be in the business of manufacturing it. So I was like, okay, I'll lay it out and manufacture it. That's been a pretty good seller. The Easy Flash 3 is another a good, that's another product that's seen some success. Um, a lot of products, or some products that CMD used to make, a lot of people like the expander. There's not much to it, but the cartridge expansion, the three slot cartridge expansion that CMD used to make for the Commodore, I reproduced that. I made some designs that I just put out there for free, like for SwiftLink. I think I made a kind of reproduction for SwiftLink, and then the other one that's a big deal is the network card. The 64 NIC. That's been a big seller. That one I did design, but initially made it as a I put it together as a fundraiser for the Cincinnati Commodore Computer Club, the C4 club. They wanted a fundraiser, and so they paid me some money to design the unit, and then they were going to sell it there. And they did that for a while, and then they weren't a growing concern, and they gave me back the rights to it. So I sell it now as a unit, and that's been a pretty consistent seller. People love having the ability to plug their Commodore into their network.
Okay. When did you incorporate TRS-80 color computing gear into your repertoire?
So about 2016, 17 timeframe, I believe, I went to a VCF Midwest show, and there was a guy there that was selling a Tandy or Radio Shack Color Computer 3 and a Texas Instruments TI 994A with the peripheral expansion box. And it was a good deal. I think he was wanting $200 for the whole thing. And I'd always wanted a TI, and I'd always seen that Radio Shack models, they always had them at the front of the Radio Shack store showing off what they do. But initially they were too expensive. I couldn't afford them. And then by the time I got so I could afford them, I already had a Commodore. So, they were just kind of things I saw when I visited the store. But they were both there, and he was selling them. So I bought them. And my view was, I don't really start to understand a system until I start designing some sort of hardware for it, because it forces me to figure out, okay, how does this thing actually work? So that's what I did. I started playing around with some projects for the Tandy just to see, how does it work? I made Coco Flash, which was like a Easy Flash 3 type cartridge for the Coco, and I had some other things as well. And I'm still learning about that, that environment. I had obviously more time to learn about the Commodore through the years than I have the Tandy, and I've started work on stuff for the TI as well. But that's kind of it. It's just, excuse me, as I get a system, then I start to think, okay, what kind of cool things could I build for this system? And then as you get into building it, you learn about the system. So it's kind of interesting. And part of it is there's some cool features in the Tandy line and the Coco. On the other hand, I don't know that people who just use a Commodore 64, for instance, appreciate some of the things that we kind of take for granted on the platform, right? So you go to the Coco, not so much the Coco 3, but like the Coco 1 and 2, the colors are just, they're just, the colors for games are just so limited. And even with the VIC-20, there was more options for colors for your game, and obviously the 64 had more yet. And then the ability to put some expansion capabilities into the Commodore 64, there's some advantages. So I think part of having the other platforms is both learning what's cool about them, but then also maybe even more appreciating some of the other platforms that you really kind of took for granted through the years.
What's on the horizon then for Retro Innovations?
Well, I have a backlog of projects. A lot of people keep asking me when I come to shows, like, hey, what's new? And the thing is, time is really what I lack at this point. So trying to finish, like memory expansions and the ability to do maybe more Wi-Fi based connectivity as opposed to, Ethernet and whatnot to do. And I know there's some projects out there for that, reproducing some items that may not, have been available for a while. I know some folks have asked me about the super CPU because some people, I resell Jiffy DOS, They're like, oh, so you own all the, when are you going to bring a super CPU to market? I'm like, I didn't, I just got a license to sell the stuff. I don't actually have all of the blueprints for all of the CMD products. But I mean, I've always thought it'd be nice to bring, things like the RAM Link or the super CPU or some derivative of them, back on the market. Um, but it's really learning how to do those things. Again, learning that next level of understanding of the Commodore platform, like something that would an understanding that would be required for the super CPU or an accelerator cartridge like that. And the other one is memory, additional memory, REU. I just got back from the Indy Classic show in Indianapolis, and I've been talking to some folks at the show and working with them. They're hopefully to the point where they've got a small self-contained REU capability that's inexpensive. It's not you got to buy some $250 cartridge to get an REU. You can, maybe pick it up for under $50 or whatever. Those are types of things I like because I like the projects that are under $75 or under $50, because I feel like even more so now than ever, that's just a meal or a couple Starbucks, cappuccinos or whatever. As you get into the $100-$200 range for a project, then all of a sudden it's like, oh, I don't know, should I buy it? Is somebody going to be mad at me if I buy it? Whether it's $30 or $50, it's like, whatever, and nobody's going to get yelled at over spending $50 on something for their personal hobby computer or whatever. So I would say those types of projects are all interesting, and then just seeing what people are potentially interested in when I go to shows. Like if if you could have something more for your computer, what would it be? And then listen to them. Sometimes it's not necessarily building it, but more of just some people come over and say, hey, I'm thinking about doing this project, a replacement for one of the chips like the VIC chip or a replacement for the CPU or whatever. And sometimes it's just, I don't necessarily think that's a project that I'll end up doing, but maybe it's something where I'll advocate for that person to finish it. They're like, that sounds like a really cool project. How can I help? I can put you in touch with my assembly people, or I can help you source some parts. I can do some testing. I'm happy to help you with your project, because I think everybody's got their specific little thing they want to play around with, and so learning all the different modes to the VIC chip to reproduce it, that's probably not my idea of a fun night, but it's somebody's idea for a fun
Mm-hmm.
night. So I'll help them get to where they need to go, and then when they get it done, maybe I'll say, hey, I'll resell it, or I'll send people your way when they ask for something like that.
So, do any of your designs incorporate Raspberry Pi technology?
Not currently, but I am working on one that has a Raspberry Pi Zero W, the tiny little board. Because one of the ideas, you mentioned TCP, sir, earlier. One of the things I thought was, I'll write this software, and sometime there'll be computers that are small enough to just run the software on a little controller, right? But for now, I'll write it for the PC, and then I'll write it for Unix, and then later on maybe I can convert it down. And so that's an idea that I still have. I know there's a number of those types of modem emulator cartridges that you can put on various computers, and that's fine. But TCP Sir's claim to fame was how accurate it was, all the way down to emulating the Hayes modem uh, break sequences and stuff like that. I still feel like there's value in that level of emulation for BBSs and stuff like that. But obviously, tethering your computer to a PC to run that software is not as fun now as it was 20 years ago. So having it be on a cartridge that you can just plug in or connect up with a cable or whatever, I think there's value there. And the other one is, again, just like I said with everything else, I have the Raspberry Pi Zero, and so I'm learning about it. It probably will suggest things that I want to do. I do know that there's a number of people that have these, you could put a Raspberry Pi on a cartridge port and you can make it emulate a cartridge and whatnot. That's cool, but I don't know. There's part of me that says that's a lot of power to hang off of the end of a 1 megahertz machine. And if you're going to do all that, there's BMC64 and other types of emulators that are bare metal emulators that you could just run the entire computer, the entire 64 on that. I I try to stay more in the processor is really kind of at arm's length from the work that's going on in the computer as opposed to just making it front and center.
Okay. Is there anything that we didn't cover tonight that you'd like to talk about?
Well, there's always, I mean, I'm thrilled that there is so much activity in the community. I remember going to one of the shows for one of the platforms back in 2016, and there were just, very small number of people at the event. Really wasn't any foot traffic. Nobody was coming in like just attendees. It was everybody that just had a booth there, and there weren't that many booths. And it was, it was a little disheartening, a little disappointing. But maybe that's what it was. Maybe that was the end of the community, or this was where it was going to kind of taper off from here. But since then, it seems like things have just, I don't know if there's been a resurgence or what. It used to be, like I said, you could buy a classic or vintage machine for a couple bucks, get it at a rummage sale or whatnot. And now I see on eBay, there's some serious money that you would spend if you want a tested machine, no matter what the platform is. And when I've gone to, like I said, I just got back from Vintage Computer Festival East on Saturday and the Indie Classic on Sunday. There was a number of people at both of those. VCF East, which is a more mature show, they had, I don't know how many people they had, but it was packed. I mean, there was so many folks that were coming through and visiting all the exhibits. And I remember some of the earlier VCF East shows where there were people, but it wasn't standing room only, and you didn't have to, you didn't run into people as you were walking from place to place. So that's nice. And then the show that I think a lot of people in the Midwest cater to is the VCF Midwest show in Chicago. And I happen to know some of the principals that put on that show. And so sometimes I get kind of the background information. But, I remember visiting their last venue that they were renting for the show. It was 12,000 square feet. And the 2023 show was just, it was elbow to elbow or shoulder to shoulder, so packed. And this year they're going to be moving to a new venue that's got 30,000 square feet. And if you'd have told me 10 years ago, we'd be having a vintage computer show where everything at the show that's going to be on display is over 20 years old, and most of it's over 30 years old, and some of it's over 40 years old. And there's going to be 30,000 square foot of it. And that's just the main hall. That doesn't include the speaking area and the auction area and kind of area where people are coming into the arena. It's probably 40,000 or 45,000 square feet when you're all said and done. And I mean, that's going to be comfortable probably, but it's not going to be bare. And I don't know how many tables that is in 30,000 square feet, but that's as large as some smaller like conferences that I went to,
Sure.
like computer conferences or whatnot. That's really cool, especially since not only is there new people coming in and people who are kind of, I would say they're not diehard, they're just like, hey, this is kind of cool, I want to see what's going on here. But there's also a lot of people that are coming to provide, to show off exhibits, and it's nice to see what everybody is doing with their platform. That's the reason I do tend to like. There's value in having the single platform shows like World of Commodore in Ontario, or in Mississauga in December, and there's other, like there's a Cocoa Fest that's coming up here May 4th and 5th in Chicago, and I know Kansas Fest, the Apple thing, is going on here in the middle of the year. There's all those single platform shows, TI in the fall and so forth. But the multi-platform shows I think are awesome as well, because you can look at what are the Atari people doing? What are the TI folks doing? What are the Tandy people doing? What are the Commodore people doing? And then you can also see some of these platforms that you faintly remember them being advertised in one of the magazines for a month or two, and then you never heard about them again. And you thought enough years have passed, you thought that thing didn't really exist. And then you show up at the show and they're like, no, I have a WizBlat 3000 and it was only available for 4 months and then the company went bankrupt or whatever. And you're like, I thought that was fake. I didn't think that thing, I thought I was misremembering what it was. Or even just weird things that companies that were a going concern delivered. A lot of people in the Commodore arena remember the Commodore 65, which was the prototype that was done in the late 80s, early 90s. And I tell people that's so funny because I remember that machine showing up in the magazines as a liquidation thing. Like we have all of these, can't tell you the name of the company, but it's a special computer and whatever, and $99 or $199 or whatever it is that you'd buy it. And everybody knew it was a Commodore 65. Everybody knew that it wasn't a produced item. Everybody knew it didn't have any support, and most of us were just like, yeah, well, we don't want that. Now they're $40,000 or $50,000 to buy one, on eBay or whatever. And everybody, the Tandy, the Coco, there was a deluxe Coco, which was a never produced item. So, not everything's as expensive as an Apple One, but a lot of them are like that. So, being able to see those esoteric machines, those prototype machines, and just generally what people are doing with their platform is really fun. In addition to getting to see people in real life that for a long time we all just knew each other through IRC and Usenet and email, and they were names, but you never knew what these people were looked like. You never knew what they sounded like. You didn't even know hardly where they lived. So being able to go to a show and walk up to you and say, "Are you Jim Brain?" And like, "Yeah." And they're like, "Well, I'm Sam." And 50, or 30 years ago, I asked you a question on Usenet about this whatever, and you were so helpful. Thank you so much for that. And you're like, wow, I'm glad to meet him and all, but that's memory that's long gone. But I'm glad that they made that connection and they took the time to come to the show and say hi. It it makes for a really fun show when folks do that, or just camaraderie and community in general.
I may be wrong, but at one of the first there's a Tandy TRS-80 show that they have every year in the fall,
Correct.
and in
Tandy
the
assembly.
Tandy Assembly, and the
Yep.
first one, Stuart Chaffee spoke,
Right.
from the co-host of the Computer Chronicles for many years,
Correct.
really the driving force behind it.
Hmm.
And I could swear I saw you in the audience when I was
I was.
watching the video. Did
I
you
was.
did you go all fanboy on Stuart?
I try not to go fanboy on. I've seen Scott Adams. I talked to Scott. Who remember the Scott Adams adventures and whatnot. He was one
Sure.
at one of the shows, and I can't remember the guy's name. I can't remember off the top of my head, but there was at one of the VCF Southeast in Atlanta. There was the person who designed the Model One, the Tandy TRS-80 Model One. He was there in the audience. I try not to go fanboy on him because I think that some people have done that to me, and it's like, ooh, that gets so uncomfortable. Um, but it was really impressive. I remember watching Computer Chronicles on PBS or wherever it was
You had
back in
to.
the day,
You had to.
and
That there
I
just
mean,
wasn't a lot
that's
of
right.
information, so you had to.
That that's right. And I wasn't a religious watcher of the show, but Stuart Chaffee was Stuart Chaffee. When he came on, you knew there was going to be some computer content, and he has a very distinct way of talking, and so you're like, oh, that's Stuart Chaffee. And so being able to listen to him, and he had some great behind the scenes stories talking
Yep.
to
Yep.
Steve Jobs and whatnot. Those were cool stories. They probably been shared previously, but I hadn't heard some of them, and it's neat to hear the behind the scenes. That's probably another aspect of things that are really cool is the computers are the computers, but a lot of the reason the computers are the way they are is less about technical and more about, the politics of the company or the market that was there at the time, or just the people that now we think of as, the Steve Jobs, the Jack Tramiels, um, the the different individuals who were at the head of those companies at the time, and the way that they ran the company sometimes dictated the software and the hardware that we ended up loving. I remember back in the day, the Commodore arena, I was so mad at Commodore in the late 80s because they just they wanted the Commodore 8-bit line to just go away because they wanted everybody to go to the Amiga. And so, as a young high school student or whatever, I was like, but I love my Commodore, it's everything I always wanted and whatnot. Why are you trying to just get rid of it? They're ditching all the peripherals. You're not wanting to put any new effort into it, whatnot. But now you look back on it as somebody who is in business or works at businesses that, and then you're like, oh, I understand. There was more markup. There probably wasn't a lot of life left in the 8-bit line. You needed to move into this 68,000 kind of 1632-bit line and whatnot. There was a lot more peripherals you could do. There was more graphics. There was a whole bunch of reasons to move that. So it was the right business decision to move. But it was all about moving. It was all about getting customers to come back, buy more products. Sometimes the products were, like for instance at VCF East, Bill Hurd, who was instrumental in working on the +4, and then of course took on the effort to do the hardware for the C128. He has tons of stories, growing up, and I know this probably is going to be only it's only going to be make sense for some of the audience, but I always wondered, why does the C128 have a Z80 in it? Like, what's the deal, right? Commodore was all about 65XX CPUs, and then all of a sudden there's a Z80. And I remember probably 5 or 6 years ago, I'm sitting there with Bill and at VCF East. I know him, I've visited with him and whatnot, and he's telling the story. And the marketing people said, this new computer has to be 100% compatible with every Commodore peripheral that we've ever made, one of which is the old CP/M cartridge for the Commodore 64, which we all knew didn't work. It barely worked on the first revision of the Commodore, and it didn't work at all on the later ones. And he knew that. And he was like, this isn't going to work. Hey, Mark, we already sent out press releases. We already told the entire, we put ads in Run Magazine and Computes Gazette and everything. We told them it was going to run everything. They could buy it. Any Commodore 64 peripheral they had, it would work. And he's like, there's no way to do it other than just designing the cartridge right into the computer, when it's just what he did. And by the time he was done, it was too late. There was one thing they could do about it. And I'm thinking, now it answered a question for me. It's like, that computer, why did it have to have that in it? Well, it did because it was a marketing requirement, and that was his only way of being able to solve that problem.
That's interesting. Hey, Jim, I thank you for your time. This has been a great talk.
No problem.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. Let's do this again soon. Take care.